One.
Whoa. Wolfpack, episode number unidentified, never caught lacking again, from the £100 million studio, downgraded to Riverside, literally sitting by a river and recording on our mobile phones with a backdrop of supposed rooms that we can still afford. But yes, this is the first Muscle and Feels podcast episode that has not been shot in person, with 3 different video sources and the erotic energy that Milo and I create in a room when we are together in the flesh. I am Pac, and alongside me I have the Wolf, Mr. Wolf himself, Milo Wolf.
I don't think you mean alongside me as much as behind you, in several ways. One way I'll leave up to the listener's discretion. Another way in which, for video watchers, you can see an actual wolf behind Pac now.
That's true, yeah. I didn't catch that. I was like, does he mean as a friend?
Where's he going with this?
So I am in my mother's office.
Yeah, I was going to ask, where are you right now?
I am in my mother's office, in the original Dr. Androulakis' office. Well,
I'm in her bedroom, so we're right at home.
Enjoy your STDs.
Thank you.
And that aside, I am in Greece, Athens, Greece, in my hometown. I came here for New Year's Eve, actually, and stayed because the UK has banned me from entering because they realized that I am indeed Greek. Just kidding. Also a British citizen, so I can go back. I'm going to be here for a couple more weeks and then go back. In my mother's office, plenty of books around me. Haven't read any of them because reading is for losers. We barely read our own studies. I mean, a lot of it is just AI-generated lorem ipsum. I'm not sure anybody reads them, but that's cool because we get away with it. And Milo, you are back in the true motherland, Southampton.
I am. So, do you know how I knew you were in Greece? I mean, obviously, I knew because I speak to you on a regular basis. But the actual way that I knew is Riverside uploads your video and audio at the same time as we're calling. And my video and audio are permanently 99% uploaded because I actually have a decent Wi-Fi connection and I'm in the UK, whereas yours is currently standing at 11%.
Yeah, I was looking at that as well, and
That's quite sad.
My download speed is around 200 megabytes per second, but the upload speed is probably
like
not
5.
that great.
Yeah,
I can see 11% uploaded. Yeah, typical Greece.
Indeed, love Greece. At any rate, I'm back in Southampton in the UK, my home country. Southampton's my home country, as they say. And yeah, had a good Christmas holiday season, whatever you call it. Alongside you in Greece as well. Well, first I went to Austria for 3 days. That's where my family's originally from and where they're currently living. Then I spent 3 days in Brussels, Belgium, which is where I grew up for 17 years, and I saw some of my friends there. And then I spent, I want to say, like 6 days in Athens, in Greece, alongside you. So, what about yourself?
That is true. Well, I worked through Christmas, as one does. Hashtag grindset. Hashtag happy Tuesday to everyone, because it's Saturday, so it's Tuesday, because Friday is the new Monday. I went just to Greece, and I'm still here, not in holiday mode anymore. Milo was with me, and we combined our break here, obviously with some training and gym-related stuff, which we'll get to in a second, but also with a research collaboration that we arranged for a study that we are currently planning for Milo's PhD, but for the literature as a whole.
Yeah, I'd say this study is, because of the way we've set it up now, which is to say we're going to collect data not just in Southampton at my university with just myself running the study essentially, but instead at several locations all across the globe. We're able to make it a much bigger study in terms of sample size and in terms of how useful I think the study will be to the overall field. So essentially, in my PhD, I already have 4 studies, and it was debatable whether or not I needed a 5th study at all. But it was kind of a topic of ongoing conversation, and there are definitely gaps that remain to be filled within literature on range of motion and muscle length and regional hypertrophy and stuff like that. Specifically, there isn't that much data in the upper body yet. There isn't any upper body data yet with relatively normal, quote-unquote, training protocols. So in a lot of studies, they have people doing only, for example, preacher curls or only skull crushers. And while that does tell you something about how people, in the gym would respond to a certain range of motion versus another, it's not at all the same as what you do in a gym. So there has to be some caution when extrapolating or generalizing those findings out to the real world. And so in addition to that, there's only been, I want to say, 3 or 4 studies on partial range of motion at long muscle lengths versus full range of motion for hypertrophy specifically. And so that's another sort of, there's some evidence, but we would like more. And then finally, the evidence that does exist on the topic suggests that training at lower muscle lengths is about as good as training at shorter muscle lengths for proximal hypertrophy. So when you're measuring hypertrophy of a muscle, you can measure it at more proximal sites or closer to its origin point. The origin point really just means like the point at which a muscle inserts that's closer to the center of your body. So it's the starting point, let's say. So you can measure hypertrophy closer to the origin point or more proximally, or closer to the insertion point or more distally. And the insertion point, again, is just the point where it attaches that's further away from the center of the body. And so one thing you see in the research is that when training at lower muscle lengths, you see similar hypertrophy at proximal sites as when training at shorter muscle lengths. But when it comes to more distal sites, like for example for the biceps, that would be closer to the elbow, you see greater hypertrophy following lower muscle length training. And so one thing that hasn't been looked at too much yet is regional hypertrophy following lower muscle length training or lower muscle length partials compared to full range of motion. And so this study was aiming to look at upper body hypertrophy using a sort of complete hypertrophy program, unlike some of the studies out there that would only do one exercise and where, people are told to, hey, please don't do any additional upper body training outside of the study, but oftentimes they do, and that becomes a confounder. And in addition, looking at low muscle length partials, which hasn't been investigated that much yet, like because a lot of studies on range of motion look at the squat, for example, a lot of the studies have looked at shorter muscle length partials. And then finally, looking at regional hypertrophy, specifically to hash out, okay, well, if there is a difference in hypertrophy between lower muscle length training and full range of motion, for example, then is that difference more so down to proximal sites? Is there no real difference? What does that look like? And so the study would be 8 weeks in duration. Participants would be assigned to one of 2 groups. Both groups run the exact same program in terms of sets, reps, exercises. All sets are performed to volitional failure, so pretty close to failure. But one group would be performing all of their exercises, all of their sets with a full range of motion, whereas the other group would be performing all of their sets, all of their exercises with a partial range of motion, so half the full range of motion, but at lower muscle lengths. So essentially the first half of the concentric or the lengthened half of the full range of motion. And before and after the study, we'd be looking at a couple of strength measurements and a couple of muscle size measurements. So the training intervention would last 8 weeks. Before the study, we would look for hypertrophy at ultrasounding the biceps and triceps at 4 sites from more proximal, so closer to the shoulder for the biceps and triceps, to more distal, so closer to the elbow for both those muscle groups, to see whether there is a regional difference in hypertrophy between full range of motion and partial range of motion at lower muscle lengths. Additionally, we'll also be using some sort of more global hypertrophy measure, like a DEXA scan or a blood pod. Yes, there will be some confounding going on from, let's say, participants in one group train their lower body more effectively, whereas the participants in the full range of motion group, for example, train their lower body less effectively. Then yes, the results would be a bit muddied by the fact that lower body training differed between groups, but it would still provide some extra data that just ultrasounding the biceps and triceps couldn't provide, because we are providing a full program for the chest, back, biceps, triceps, side delts, front delts, and so forth. And so we wanted a more global hypertrophy measure that could help provide some more data on the topic. And then for strength, finally, we would look at 6 repetition maximums in some of the exercises being performed during the program. So all sets will be performed with between 5 and 15 repetitions. And for the exercises that are being performed for 6 repetitions, we'll be looking at 6 repetition maximums, so the most weight they can lift for 6 reps, both before and after the study, on the exercises they're performing in that rep range. And we would look at both the partial range of motion 6 rep max, so the partial range of motion in that lengthened position, and also the full range of motion, 6 repetition maximums. So that's the aim of the study. Additionally, for strength, we'll also be recording how much weight people actually used for each exercise to see, okay, maybe people saw more of an increase in working load in the partial range of motion group or vice versa. But we would look at regional hypertrophy, overall hypertrophy, 6 repetition maximums, and working load. And the reason why we went to Greece, well, in part, and reached out to researchers there, and why we reached out to some researchers in New Zealand as well, shout out Eric Helms, is in order to increase the sample size of the study. So because we'll be dealing mostly with relatively trained lifters, so I expect the average sort of training age in that study will be around I think we'll set a minimum of 3 years of lifting experience, and likely the average age might be around 5 years of lifting experience. And so because the relatively advanced trainees, quote unquote, and the magnitude of improvement in muscle size and strength is pretty small when you get to that stage, it can be quite challenging to detect differences unless you're dealing with a really, either a really large sample size or a really powerful treatment. And in this case, I don't foresee that range of motion would have a huge impact. It conceivably would have an impact based on what I've seen in literature, but it wouldn't be a big enough impact that if we had 5 people in each group, we'd see a difference for sure. And so we need a decent amount of people in each group. And so because it's already relatively challenging to get trained lifters to commit to a training intervention, so we wouldn't be able to get many people if we did data collection only on one site, and that would really limit the usefulness of that study. We thought, look, let's reach out to some researchers who might be interested and see whether or not we can run the same study with similar measurement methods, so ultrasound primarily, and run that study in different countries and different universities so they can get more people in each group, have greater confidence in the findings, actually be able to detect differences in outcomes that resulted as a consequence of the range of motion used. And yeah, I think it should make for a really good study.
No. Yes, it will be a potential classic. Obviously, terms and conditions apply. We have to do it as well, and we can flex the study when it's finally done. But I guess it's useful to say that, hey, if for any reason you're listening and you're either in Southampton, Athens, or Auckland, New Zealand, and participating in such a study sounds somewhat interesting to you, and you would be able to be physically present there in the lab for your pre and post measurement tests, then yeah, reach out. We'll obviously
Absolutely
be advertising the actual study, and we'll make sure that everybody who follows us hears about it. But yeah, if for any reason you're listening and you're interested, hit us up. Or if you want to travel to any of those locations.
Indeed, I was going to say that. And more importantly, I forgot to mention one detail, and that's that we'll be giving people programs to follow in their own time, in their own gym, which means that all you'd have to commit to would be 2 measurement sessions at one of these labs before the study and 2 measurement sessions after the study. The remainder of the study can be done in your own gym, whether you're in a home gym and so forth, as long as you have access to the equipment required. But so even if, let's say, you live in somewhere else in the UK or somewhere else in Greece, and you're willing to make a bit of a commitment and say, okay, I'm going to spend 2 days in Southampton or 2 days in Athens, once before the study and once after the study, you'd technically be able to take part in the study and provide some very useful data to the community for the love of the sport, as they say.
You get a free program as well, designed by us, and keep in mind that the program, and that's one of the main reasons that we wanted to not just look at one muscle group or do a lab-based study, is that we will design a program that will be both on paper and in practice optimized for hypertrophy in terms of overall volume and exercise selection. So you would be getting a program that for the upper body is pretty OP, as the youngsters would say. And at the same time, as we said, we will probably include, at least in the Athens and the Southampton locations, a DEXA or a BOTPOD. So you would get a free assessment, a body composition assessment, pre and post as well, whatever that means.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good reason to do the study. So I know DEXAs, for example, in the case of Athens, are relatively expensive. So if only for that reason, not even for anything else, I think taking part in the study can be cool in that way. Same with bod pod, although bod pod's a bit less accurate, let's say.
Yeah, for sure. So buy the study, buy into it. We're
Indeed.
selling you a study. This is what science has become these days. Back in the day, you'd have these "do you even lift" old people with glasses and weird hair writing down, multiplying numbers with letters and all kinds of impossible stuff.
Why though?
And now science is this. Two jacked guys on the internet
Trying to
selling
sell
you.
Using science as your vehicle to convince you. I was actually thinking today, earlier, does the fact that I'm now doing exclusively lengthened partials in my training make me seem like more of a shill to people, you think?
Yes and no. I think that it portrays you as a true evidence-based freak, because the justification behind you doing the lengthened partials is because you did do a deep dive in the literature and you're like, hey, this seems cool.
Yeah.
But I'm pretty sure that if the outcomes of your study and this study are super negative, which I doubt based on the literature, I think you would make the switch to, hey, full ROM and partials instead of just partials.
Yeah, I'd say I'd actually maybe go the other way around, where I think currently people are... I think the charitable interpretation of what I'm doing is like, oh, cool, he's he's really evidence-based, he's putting his money where his mouth is, etc. The negative interpretation, especially if the studies that I'm doing on the calves and this one turn out to be in favor of lengthened partials or partials in general, would be, oh, he really has something to sell here, he has an agenda. Big, long muscle length has been paying him all his time. Look at him selling us his coaching, telling us to pause at the fully lengthened position.
It's unavoidable, though. I had a chat the other day with a couple of gentlemen about the minimum dose stuff, and they were like, yeah, we still hammer some of our more elite lifters with a ton of volume, and people call us dinosaurs for that. And people have used the data that came out from our studies to sort of make the point that, hey, less is always more, which was not the case. And no matter the disclaimers, no matter the open science approach to our data and cautious interpretation, people will always use that quote unquote against you or misinterpret it. So yeah, thanks for selling out, Milo, and nice on the studies that you are doing.
Indeed. It's crazy. In 2 weeks, I'll be done with the study, even though it's 8 weeks and we haven't started yet. But just don't ask any questions as to how it happened, why it happened, why
6,000 participants. Yeah.
That's a pretty good number, isn't it? I like 6,000. That's good.
I love how this turned into yet another long muscle lengths episode.
Hey, the people love it. The analytics everywhere, the hashtag long muscle length is trending on Instagram. It's happening.
And now that we mentioned traveling, one topic that we wanted to go over today and briefly-ish discuss is training, dieting, and just staying on the gain train.
I have an interruption.
Okay. Is it a cat? It's a cat.
I'm going to introduce the cat.
Hey, nice. She loved
Terrified.
that.
Hated it.
Get the fuck off me, bro. Get the fuck off me, man. 55th Street. You 5 me? That's from Channel 5 on YouTube, the YouTube channel. A guy from 55th Street who had committed to using 5 in replacing irregular words. So you would say, you 5 me? Anyways, ADHD aside, yeah, we've been traveling. You've been traveling quite a bit. I'm still away, but I've somewhat settled in. But during the holidays, something that a lot of people go through is a period of 1 to 2 weeks where they are away from their usual schedule, their usual gym, their usual routine in terms of eating and training. And they often find it super challenging to stay on the gain train, sometimes purely from a psychological standpoint, other times both from a psychological and practical standpoint. So that's something that we want to touch on, because I think both of us are quite the veterans when it comes to, hey, I'm traveling. Like last year, I went to over 9 countries in a few months. I still managed to not miss, quote unquote, any training sessions and maintain my weight and did my things.
Wait a minute. Did you just say 9 countries in 2 months?
In 12 months.
I heard 2 months. what the hell are you doing? What were you doing? We're just going to like Luxembourg and then Liechtenstein and then Belgium and then
Just back and forth.
indeed and double
Greece,
count.
Bulgaria, Greece, Bulgaria, Greece, Bulgaria, Greece, Bulgaria.
Indeed.
So I guess the first point, and that will be mostly training related, that I want to bring up, is something that really helps when traveling is accepting that there's a high chance that you won't be able to stick to your usual routine in terms of exercises, session length, and so on and so forth. But that should not detract from the fact that you can still stay on point in terms of your overall goal, even if that's hypertrophy, strength, maximal strength, or both. So accepting that, hey, yeah, you may not be able to do the 7 triples on safety bar squat and then a bunch of your accessories, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't do something else that will still be good enough or more than good enough for a few weeks.
Agreed. And I think your approach to training during the holidays can really fall on the spectrum depending on who you are, what your goals are. I have, for myself and for a lot of clients who are quite committed and consistent, I will generally, if it's just a week of holidays, for example, try and plan for a deload, right? So set up training in a way that would have them reasonably fatigued and reasonably in need of a deload by that point.
Overreached.
Indeed, as they say. But that's for clients who have a pretty structured training program already, and it's only a week of traveling typically, or maybe like 10 days. Like there's a bit of give and take, right? Like if a deal is 5 days, that's fine too. If it's 10 days, that's not a huge deal either. So that can be an approach. Another approach would be and by deload, I mean anything from training cessation altogether for like a week. Realistically, you're not going to lose much, if any, muscle or strength during a week. There's some pretty good data on that. And it can help with if you're traveling to a country where, there's no access to a gym or you're very busy or what have you. That can be helpful in that case. But then I think for a lot of clients who are either less accustomed to training consistently, and so we want to kind of build up the habit of training consistently. And if they travel a lot, for example, like I've got a client, for example, now who is traveling, I want to say like a week in January and another week or two in February and then another like to Europe, for example, from the US. And so a lot of traveling, a lot of long distance traveling. In those cases, I think you want to find a way to train while on holidays. And that can take a variety of forms depending on what you have access to, right, and what your goals are. I think the more specific your goals are in terms of performance, the more challenging it becomes. So if you're a powerlifter, for example, and you're close to a meet, so your goals are very specific, right? Like you're competing in powerlifting and you're competing soon, then it becomes a bit more challenging unless you have access to a good gym. But I think for hypertrophy, you can be quite flexible in that even if you don't have any equipment, you could still get at least enough volume in to maintain your muscle, like doing some pistol squats, sissy squats, for example, for lower body, maybe some single leg RDLs with whatever resistance you have, if you have any, some push-ups and some inverted rows or pull-ups for upper body, and you're pretty well covered as far as maintaining muscle goes. And in fact, if you do enough volume on those, you may even be able to gain some muscle and strength. But that's for the person who has literally nothing. But in most cases, most people have at least enough time in their week to go to the gym like twice, 3 times, 4 times, right? Even if that session is not like 3 hours long. And in those cases, it's really a question of, okay, you have access to a gym, you have at least some time in your week, maybe not quite as much as usual, or you're not willing to go to the gym as often as usual, but you have some time. And in that case, I think the main thing to be more flexible on is just exercise selection. Like rep ranges, realistically, if you're in a gym, you can have enough weight at your disposal to make the rep range you want to make work. You can make it work. Likewise, with how close to failure you train and so forth, there can be cases where it makes sense to, for example, train a bit further from failure if you're stressed out from traveling or have you, or you're jet lagged and your sleep's worse and stuff like that. But rep range and RPE and stuff, you can accommodate for pretty well. Likewise, number of sets, unless you have time constraints, usually not really much of a need to change that. Again, provided fatigue and recovery aren't really concerns. But then the main thing is really just exercise selection. You may not have access to your favorite machine row that you have back at home in your gym. So for example, while I was in Athens, my program called for machine rows. The gym didn't have any machine rows, so I wound up doing cable rows. Now, this specific gym, the machine didn't work very well. I tried to do the full stack for a set of, 8 to 12 reps, pretty controlled. And as I was doing like the 6th rep with full stack, the cable snapped and I backflipped / tumbled backwards onto the floor and it was broken. So Obviously, don't do that if you can. But I think generally you can find pretty comparable alternatives. So after that, for example, the dumbbell rows, which again, it's a relatively similar movement pattern, if only for the exception of you're bent over. But in terms of stimulating muscle growth, it's not that dissimilar, and they would accomplish a similar goal. And if you want to be super neurotic about exercise selection and being consistent in the exercise you use, you could say, oh, we have some evidence saying that the gains in strength in the first few weeks of using an exercise are all neuromuscular improvements, and you actually don't gain any muscle for the first few weeks of doing an exercise, so you need to have it in your program for months and months to really muck it out, let's say. But realistically, if you've been training for more than a few weeks or a few months, and you're accustomed to doing rowing in general, you can get really good results from even if you switch exercises every session, every couple sessions. Is it ideal? Probably not, is my hunch. Because after you get used to an exercise and you sort of track progression consistently and so forth, you can build up some quote-unquote momentum. But by all means, we're talking about a relatively small difference in your results. So, if you're usually doing machine rows, don't be afraid to do cable rows instead, or doing dumbbell rows instead. Whatever you have access to that's going to work pretty well is going to do you, plenty well in terms of stimulating muscle growth.
Yeah, especially in such a short period of time. Indeed. Anything you do for a week, it really, really doesn't matter. There was a recent systematic review and meta-analysis on exercise variation where essentially, aside from saying that, we need better data and more data out there to really understand whether constantly varying your exercises has a huge effect on gains. Overall, it seems like a methodic approach, a systematic approach to varying exercises in the long term makes sense, where you do include plenty of exercise for a specific muscle group that target all its functions and so on and so forth. But in the context of 1 week, if you don't have access to a lat pull down and you do pull-ups or chin-ups or dumbbell pullovers, that's totally fine. Mia there, guest starring. For those that are watching, the cat is somewhat on the screen. Shout out to her. And again, we mentioned that before, and I'm going to mention it again. As long as you're training close to failure or to failure, and you're performing a minimum of 3 to 6 sets per muscle group per week, you are more than solid. Especially if you don't, even if you have time, you may not want to spend that time in the gym. All
right, Mike Menser.
Yeah, exactly. But we personally enjoy training while being away. We didn't necessarily have to. Even if we took a week off training, everything would be fine. But we do really enjoy training. But some of our sessions that we did together were not, 100% complete sessions or optimal, but they were still good enough to, keep us on the gain train and psychologically give us that tap on the back, that reassurance tap on the back that said, hey, all is well. But we know from the literature as well that you need very little to maintain muscle mass. So literally, as Milo said, anything will cover you. So don't think that, I can't do exactly what I had planned or exactly what I would normally do. Might as well do nothing. Even just a little bit will take you a very long way.
Yeah, so I think that's very true. There's a couple of things I picked up on. One is, you could also plan for the easier part of your training block to coincide with your traveling. So it's not just deload weeks that you can make coincide with traveling. If you have harder and easier phases of your training, or let's say, for example, more hypertrophy focused phases of your training, making those happen while traveling is probably a better idea than making the super specific phases or the harder phases happen while traveling. And then the second thing is, for muscle growth, it's important to keep in mind that muscle growth as an adaptation is remarkably non-specific. You can achieve muscle growth pretty well using a variety of modalities, using a variety of rep ranges, using a variety of RPEs and so forth. So just because you don't have the ideal machine, just because it doesn't have the ideal resistance curve, and it's not what you're used to, so there is some variation involved, it really doesn't mean that you can't achieve muscle growth. So I think for people who are a bit concerned with a bit perfectionistic or slightly neurotic about training, it can be a bit destabilizing. But having some idea of what the data says about, hey, rep ranges for hypertrophy, hey, RPE for hypertrophy, or even to an extent volume for hypertrophy, and exercise selection, knowing that the exact range of motion you go through, the exact RPE you hit, the exact rep range you hit. There's some pretty large ranges for all of those that work pretty well. Knowing that can really give you some peace of mind about, oh, I'm traveling, I may not make the best gains of my life in terms of, maybe I'm jet lagged, maybe I'm sleeping less than usual, maybe I'm more stressed, maybe I don't have as much time, maybe the machines I have aren't as good. But those are relatively minor concerns unless, you're super stressed or really sleep deprived. And so, yeah, I think people sometimes also have an all or nothing mentality, both when it comes to the progress they think they can achieve while traveling, but also with whether or not they should even train while traveling. Like sometimes I have clients where they think that if they can train, there are 5 days a week or 4 days a week, what have you, that they shouldn't train at all. And oftentimes that's not true. And I think it's a super useful skill to cultivate, to be able to train while on holidays, while not in a familiar environment. So it's a different skill to build a habit than to maintain a habit, and yet another one is to adapt a habit, if that makes sense, into different circumstances. So, for example, one thing that people use in behavioral psychology is called a coping plan, which is basically when, let's say, for example, as a goal, you want to go on more walks, right? You encounter a consistent difficulty in going for walks because it's raining, right? So there's a clear sort of barrier or obstacle here, which is it's raining and you don't like walking when it's raining. And so coping plan would say, okay, then in that case, just write down when it's raining, I'll take my raincoat with me, or I'll prepare for that by taking my umbrella to work, what have you. And likewise, I think learning how to adapt to unfamiliar circumstances, different gyms, etc., can be a really helpful skill to cultivate however you can for long-term success as a lifter.
Yeah, for sure. And it for some people, I think it will also allow them to make training more enjoyable in the long term, holidays and time away aside, by disconnecting a bit from the perfectionist side of things and understanding that, hey, cool, yeah, if you are trying to maximize and gain every bit of muscle possible, that's cool, and controlling for everything and being super meticulous with your training is fine. But at the end of the day, even when you're not traveling and you have busy periods or things are happening in your life, that ability to adapt, which you will use for traveling, you can also channel it there. And then as time passes and you've done it, you've done it for a few years, you can always look back and use past experience as positive reinforcement and say, oh wow, I've still made awesome gains the past 3 years, even though I traveled a bit and I wasn't always on my schedule or on my program. And yeah, it's super cool to be able to do that. So speaking personally and for yourself as well, because we do have quite a bit of traveling lined up this year as well. And as long as I have access to some form of resistance, ideally, even a pair of dumbbells and maybe like a cable machine can be more than enough for me to make things work, at least for a short period of time without any stress.
And it's not like you train legs anyways, so.
Exactly, because who trains legs? It's 2023. It's all
Get
about
over it.
The guns.
No one
How
cares.
about the nutrition side of things? Because we did see, at least I did, I saw a fair amount of posts, as I do every year, during the holidays on how to eat during the holidays. Some posts would say, things like, oh, it's just a few days, enjoy yourself. Other posts would say, make sure you stay on it and it's not an excuse to pig out. Other posts said, hey guys, who cares? But I think we are also pretty good at that side of things too, because we did have our New Year's Eve meals and we had drinks, and I had plenty of drinks a couple of nights back to back, but we still made them fit in our overall expenditure by staying active. So we still hit our 12 to 15,000 steps a day and our mini gym sessions, as well as we budgeted for those calories. So that's another skill I think we've developed, which allows us to be pretty flexible when traveling. And I think other people can learn from that too.
Yeah, I think with eating during holidays, we run into a pretty big issue. And I think it's hard to give generalizable recommendations to people when it comes to eating. There's people out
Yeah.
there with, for example, eating disorders or even just disordered eating and stuff like that. And so the advice you would give to people who have that versus people who are perfectly like, oh, no issues at all with eating at all, would be substantially different. So I'm, for example, probably the worst example in terms of being generalizable. Like during the holidays, besides trying to get a decent protein intake in and generally eating to satiation, I just kind of ate whatever I wanted and maintained weight perfectly. Because I was, again, it's the same things for training with the steps we do and being physically active, where being able to adapt into saying, okay, I'm traveling, usually I hit 12,000 steps a day. Sure, I might not be able to hit 12,000 steps every day and maybe not have an average as high as usual, but being able to adapt to the circumstances slightly and still get some steps in is going to help a lot in terms of weight management and allowing you to eat and also enjoy yourself.
Yep.
I think for most people, you're not going to fall on the extremes of, okay, I'm going to pig out all the time and just literally eat whatever I want all the time and not pay any attention at all. That's probably not the best solution for most people. Likewise, though, you're probably not going to be a person who's going to bring your meal prep or bring your beef jerky everywhere you go and never have any food that's on site.
Yep.
And so I think it depends on your goals once more. Like if you've got super specific goals and you're close to competing, for example, this time around, we can use the example of a physique athlete. If you're like 2 weeks out from a show, honestly, don't travel. It's probably not the best idea, unless you have to. But if, for example, you're in the off season, you're in a slight surplus, it can be really easy. So for me, for example, I was already in a slight surplus before traveling, and that was also kind of the aim while traveling. Sure, I wasn't necessarily intent on getting as big of a surplus as usual, given that my training stimulus may not have been quite as nice, I guess. But it's not like I was really thinking about, oh, I need to minimize my surplus or anything. But I think depending on your goals, you can be more or less flexible, and depending on your relationship with food as well. And that's why I think there is so much variance in how people recommend what their clients should do during traveling and so forth. I'm generally a lot more client-centered when it comes to giving recommendations. So for clients, for example, who I know are consistently on their shit, like have no issues with disordered eating or anything, I'll be like, yeah, okay, let's keep an eye on your body weight. Let's make sure it stays where we want it, etc. As long as that's being achieved, I'm happy for you to do what you want to, essentially. Whereas for other clients, if fitness isn't the main thing in their life at all, and they want to enjoy their holidays, and their family is a huge part of their life, and being sociable with them involves food, involves drinking, etc., then oftentimes I'll be okay with accepting some degree of weight gain. That's okay, because ultimately it's a fraction of the year, and if fitness isn't that important to them, it's reasonably important, but it's not as important as enjoying their time, and enjoying their time comes with eating a good deal of food. For a lot of people, that might mean some weight gain, and that's fine because then they have another 45 weeks in the year to lose some weight, for example.
Yeah, so that's another great point around the fact that it is 1 or 2 weeks of being away, and again, if you have some of those habits built in where you're not going to just turn on the absolute YOLO mode as far as food and not training goes, and you still hit your physical activity goals, or at least on some days you still get some training in, and overall you're somewhat aware of how much you're eating. Even if you eat a couple of days here and there on a surplus, you may still end up averaging it out by the end of the week. But even if you're on a slight surplus by the end of the week on average, and even especially if you've trained, and that's a point I make with a lot of clients, is that worst case scenario, you were in a slight surplus and you trained, so maybe you're also making some gains. At least the calories are going somewhere. But the main point here is there's not much to worry about. And the idea of a few, because like you have Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, and maybe another huge planned meal, and then just the holiday food that is around. It's really, really not that significant amount of time to completely ruin your progress. But at the same time, sorry, just wanted to say that I think for a lot of people, going away from tracking or thinking about macros specifically and just doing their best to maybe prioritize protein, but in some cases just trying to guesstimate overall calories and knowing that, hey, if my goal is 3,000, I'm somewhere around that. that's fine as well, because a lot of the holiday foods may not be as high in protein as we like, and not hitting your protein goal or your fiber goal for a few days or a week is totally fine, especially if you're somewhere close to your overall calorie goal and you're still training and moving around.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's somewhat comforting and interesting to keep in mind that just like with exercise selection, rep ranges, and RP and stuff for hypertrophy, the exact calorie state, as long as it's within reason, the exact caloric state in which you're in for that duration of time really doesn't matter all that much. Let's say, for example, you wind up being, let's say usually you struggle with getting enough food in and you're trying to bulk. Let's say you end up being in a 500 calorie deficit. Honestly, that would not really be a big concern. Yes, you'd see less muscle growth, but you'd also see a bit of fat loss. And so in the long term, because you'd probably eventually want to cut again anyways, it wouldn't be a huge deal. Likewise, if you're usually in a slight deficit, but now you're in a slight surplus instead, yeah, sure, you have an extra maybe like half kilogram or a kilogram of weight to lose. But at the same time, you gain some muscle. You had a slight diet break. Like there's oftentimes, because it's such a short duration of time and there's some benefits to a variety of situations, it's not a huge deal to your overall goal. Again, unless you're in that super specific and super time constricted or time bound thing of competing or what have you. Yeah, and the second thing is, I think some of the rules, I guess you call them habits or dietary rules, and obviously rules are more appropriate, for example, for people with a good relationship with food and so forth. But some of the rules you apply to your off-season or eating generally when you're at home that allow you to have a quote-unquote healthy diet that is also conducive to your goals, whether that's weight gain, weight loss, and so forth. Some of those same rules can be applied reasonably well, maybe not in their usual magnitude or severity or strictness, but they can be applied reasonably well while on holidays as well. So, for example, I generally, when I'm at home, like right now, I try and aim to get around 10 to 15 servings of fruits and vegetables a day. That's kind of what I aim for. Sometimes it's more than that, but that's what I try and get most days. And yeah, sure, while I'm traveling, I don't have quite as much control over food. For example, I might have, on average, like one meal with family a day, maybe a couple, or with friends. Sure, in that case, I have a bit less flexibility, but I will still try and make a point to get, at least 5, maybe 8 in a day. Likewise with protein, sure, I might not be able to hit 1.8 grams per kilogram every day, but I will try and hit maybe, I don't know, at least 1.2, 1.3, 1.4. At the same time, in my meals on my own, I'll make an effort to get, ideally, at least 2 or 3 protein feedings in across the day. And so you can kind of almost negotiate with yourself in terms of to what extent you need to downgrade your habits or downgrade your rules to enjoy it, but also to still be conducive overall to a reasonable outcome, I guess.
Yep. Totally agree. You hit the nail on the head. Top guy. And yeah, I think that wraps it up for the holiday stuff, I guess.
You're still on holidays for 2 more weeks, so
it's not really holidays anymore. So, and I have my own flat and my own desk and a gym that is nearby.
I have a huge house, I have a mansion with its own landing strip and a huge pool. Tremendous. Gigantic.
But yeah, during the holidays, the parties, the people over, the guests. Now I'm essentially in the Southampton quote unquote routine, but in Athens, Greece, maybe with slightly less flexibility. But just to before we completely wrap this up, as you said, if you're a physique competitor or a powerlifter, you're probably much less flexible than the Gen Pop individual who just wants to get bigger and stronger. But if you are a Gen Pop individual who wants to get bigger and stronger, the game can be relatively easy and straightforward as long as you make those couple of adjustments and try to force them a couple of times and then make them a habit.
Yeah, I think the biggest cases where things can go wrong, in my experience, is with people who try and, like, let's say, especially with any sort of beginning of disordered eating or issues in that sense, is when they, see advice that says, hey, be overly restrictive and, you can't allow yourself to eat anything different than usual, etc. And then that restriction and improper approach then causes issues, like big issues, like, they'll have binge eating episodes or what have you. I think generally it's really important to keep in mind that your approach to holidays should be individualized. especially with diet. I'd say with training also, but because eating is a bit more of a sensitive topic, I think it should definitely be individualized, and you shouldn't just take your favorite fitfluencer's advice on this is how you should treat your holidays. So that's worth keeping in mind, I think.
For sure. Nice. And also, we've said nice and then also a few
Freaks.
times. But yeah, freaks. Also keep in mind that most, if not all people, will go through those couple of days here and there where they do overeat and maybe train less and feel bad. And it's totally normal for that to happen. But as we said, just because a couple of days were off or a week was off, it really doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things, as long as you don't let it then become 2 months of YOLO eating and not training.
Agreed, 100%. Whoa.
Okay, buy the study that Milo advertised, participate, and make long muscle lengths. Yeah, there's also an NFT and a coin coming out.
Remaining.
Long muscle length coin, long coin, which you should buy. It's totally not going to be rug.
Pump and dump.
Yeah, pump and dump. And the NFT is Milo's face. And there's plenty of variations, smiling and not smiling, which is essentially the same face, and that face as well. And yeah, buy it, and it's totally legit. So links for all that in bio.
All right, shall we wrap it up?
We shall wrap it up by saying bye.
Peace.
Peace.